The cabin was bustling with the usual pre-flight chaos, overhead bins slamming shut, flight attendants weaving through narrow aisles with forced smiles, and passengers squeezing past each other with murmured apologies. He was already seated, a tall black man in his late 30s, dressed sharply in a charcoal grey suit, his eyes focused on the tablet in his lap. He barely looked up as passengers filed in, oblivious to the eyes that sometimes lingered a little too long. His name was Daniel, and he was used to it. The double takes, the subtle shifts of purses, the polite but distant nods. He'd long since grown accustomed to the silent dance of discomfort his presence sometimes caused. Today, he was focused on the presentation he was set to give, a proposal that could change everything for his firm. He didn't notice the woman until she stopped right next to his row, her manicured fingers clutching her boarding pass tightly. She was in her early 50s, impeccably dressed, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun. She glanced down at her ticket, then back up at the seat number, her mouth tightening as if she'd tasted something sour. Without sitting down, she flagged down the nearest flight attendant, a young woman with tired eyes and a patient smile. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice clipped. "There must be some mistake. I'm supposed to be sitting here." She gestured vaguely to the empty seat beside Daniel, "but I can't possibly sit here." The flight attendant blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "I'm sorry," she replied politely. "Your seat is 14B, right next to him." The woman straightened her posture, her chin lifting defiantly. "I want another seat." "I'm not sitting here," she insisted, her voice rising just enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Daniel finally looked up from his tablet, his eyes calm and expression neutral, watching the exchange unfold. He said nothing, just waited, the corners of his mouth fixed in a line of practiced patience. The flight attendant hesitated, her gaze flicking to Daniel and then back to the woman. "I'm afraid the flight is fully booked," she explained, her tone measured. "There are no other available seats." The woman huffed, crossing her arms tightly. "I don't care. I'm not sitting here. Find me another seat." Her voice grew louder, and Daniel could feel the eyes on him now, sharp, judgmental, waiting for a reaction that he refused to give. He returned his gaze to his tablet, ignoring the burning sting of humiliation creeping up his neck. The flight attendant's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She straightened, a spark of determination lighting her eyes. "One moment," she said, turning on her heel and disappearing up the aisle. The woman sighed dramatically, glancing around as if to collect approval from the other passengers. Daniel kept his eyes down, his fingers scrolling through his presentation as if nothing were happening. He'd been here before, in 1,000 different ways. Minutes later, the flight attendant returned, flanked by another crew member, a man with a crisp uniform and a name badge that read Chief Purser. His expression was neutral, professional. He stepped forward, nodding at the woman. "I understand there's an issue with your seating," he began smoothly. "I'd like to make sure you're comfortable." Relief washed over her face. "Yes, thank you," she said, shooting a triumphant look at Daniel, who still hadn't lifted his eyes. "I knew there had to be a mistake." The chief purser smiled politely, then turned to Daniel. "Sir, on behalf of the airline, I'd like to extend an invitation for you to join us in first class. We'd like you to travel comfortably for the duration of the flight." For the first time, Daniel looked up, surprise flickering across his features. "Are you sure?" he asked cautiously, glancing around as if expecting the offer to be a mistake. The purser nodded firmly. "Absolutely, sir. Please, gather your things." A ripple of murmurs swept through the cabin as Daniel stood, gathering his briefcase and tablet, his movements deliberate and composed. He looked the woman squarely in the eyes, offering a small, courteous nod before stepping into the aisle. Her face blanched, confusion twisting her features. "Wait," she stammered, looking between Daniel and the flight crew. "I thought, what about me?" The purser's smile didn't waver. "As I mentioned earlier, the flight is fully booked. There are no other available seats." Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, disbelief etched in every wrinkle of her expression. But I. She spluttered. The purser didn't flinch. "We do our best to ensure all of our passengers are comfortable," he said smoothly. "Please take your seat." Daniel disappeared into first class, and the woman sank stiffly into the now vacant seat, her posture rigid, her eyes staring straight ahead. Around her, passengers exchanged glances, some nodding approvingly, others murmuring beneath their breaths. The engines roared to life, and the flight attendants moved to complete their safety checks, their expressions carefully neutral. The woman sat alone, her gaze locked forward, and not a single person offered her a glance of sympathy. Meanwhile, in first class, Daniel settled into his seat, his shoulders finally relaxing as he opened his laptop. The stewardess brought him a glass of champagne, her smile warm and genuine. "Compliments of the airline," she said softly, and he thanked her with a nod, his voice steady. As he took a sip, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, reading the message that had just come through. "They found her. The deal is done. It's time." Daniel's hand paused over the glass, his eyes sharpening with sudden clarity. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and leaned back in his seat, a quiet smile playing on his lips. Outside the window, clouds parted to reveal a clear, endless sky. His gaze drifted back to the cabin, where the woman sat stiff and silent. He took another sip of champagne, savoring the moment, knowing the real turbulence had only just begun. Daniel's hand paused over the glass, his eyes sharpening with sudden clarity. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and leaned back in his seat, a quiet smile playing on his lips. Outside the window, clouds parted to reveal a clear, endless sky. His gaze drifted back to the cabin, where the woman sat stiff and silent. He took another sip of champagne, savoring the moment, knowing the real turbulence had only just begun. The flight cruised at 30,000 feet, and Daniel's fingers tapped rhythmically on his laptop. He was no longer reviewing his presentation. His screen now displayed a series of encrypted files, each one labeled with a date and a name. His eyes flickered with focus, his expression steely and unyielding. Another message pinged on his phone: "The transfer is complete. Her location is secured." He allowed himself the briefest exhale, then typed back a single word: "Execute." Back in coach, the woman fidgeted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting nervously around the cabin. Passengers nearby stole glances, whispering behind their hands, but she remained resolutely upright, her hands clenched in her lap. It was only when a flight attendant approached with a sealed envelope that she snapped back to attention. "This is for you," the attendant said softly, setting the envelope on her tray table. The woman stared at it, suspicion flaring in her eyes. "Who sent this?" she demanded, her voice cracking slightly. The attendant only smiled politely. "I'm afraid I don't know. I was simply asked to deliver it." With trembling hands, she opened the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper. Her eyes scanned the text, and the color drained from her face. Words burned into the page: "The past always finds its way back. Seat 14B is just the beginning." She looked up wildly, scanning the rows, but every face was turned away. No one was watching, and yet she felt eyes on her, unseen, unblinking. Back in first class, Daniel closed his laptop and leaned back, folding his hands over his chest. The stewardess returned, her expression professional but her eyes flickering with curiosity. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Just a little more champagne. I think we'll be celebrating sooner than expected." He watched her walk away before glancing out the window, the clouds stretching infinitely beneath them. His phone buzzed one last time. This time, there was no message, just a chessboard emoji and the single word: "Checkmate." Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the screen, the image of the woman frozen beside the man in the black suit, a man whose face was deliberately pixelated, marked with the word redacted. His fingers hovered over the keys, hesitating for the first time since the plane had taken off. He watched the screen flicker, a cursor blinking expectantly, waiting for his next command. His phone buzzed again, this time with a single word: "Execute." He leaned back, his gaze drifting over the cabin's partition into coach. He couldn't see her from his seat, but he could feel the tension simmering in the recycled air. The woman was scrambling, he was sure of it. Secrets were like smoke, hard to catch, but they always found a way to linger. He took a deep breath, eyes narrowing as he slipped his phone into his pocket and stood up. The flight attendant gave him a curious glance, but he brushed it off with a smile. "Just stretching my legs," he murmured. In coach, the woman clutched her phone, her hands trembling as she refreshed her inbox for the 5th time in as many minutes. The screen remained blank, no responses, no lifelines. Her eyes darted around the cabin, noting the whispers, the sideways glances. She knew this feeling, the sensation of being watched, evaluated, judged. It was the same feeling she'd had when she left the courthouse that night, the folder clutched against her chest like a shield. That damn folder. She should have known it was too heavy a secret to carry alone. The plane jolted again, harder this time, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be making an emergency landing at an undisclosed location. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. Undisclosed location? Her breath caught in her throat. That wasn't standard protocol. She fumbled with her seatbelt, fingers slick with sweat. Across the aisle, a man with salt and pepper hair glanced her way, his eyes lingering just a little too long. She looked away quickly, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. A shadow passed over her, and she looked up to find Daniel standing in the aisle, hands tucked casually into his pockets. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice smooth and unhurried. Her eyes widened. I'm sorry, do I know you?" she stammered. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Not yet." Without waiting for her permission, he slipped into the empty seat beside her, buckling his seatbelt with a practiced flick of his wrist. She stiffened, her gaze flicking toward the flight attendants, but they were busy whispering among themselves, their eyes occasionally darting toward the cockpit door. She swallowed hard. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel smiled again, the kind of smile that belonged on magazine covers and political posters. "I think you know exactly what I want," he replied. "Or more specifically, what they want." He nodded toward the sealed cockpit door, and her stomach plummeted. "I'm just here to facilitate," he added. She shook her head, panic rising in her throat. No, I don't have it. I swear I don't," she whispered urgently. His eyes glinted with something sharp and dangerous. "You had it," he corrected. "And now it's just a matter of finding where you put it." Her hands balled into fists on her lap. "I'm not telling you anything," she snapped, her voice shaking but resolute. Daniel's smile only widened. "You don't have to. I already know where to look." Before she could react, the plane jolted once more, this time so violently that oxygen masks tumbled from the ceiling, swaying like pendulums. Passengers gasped, hands fumbling to secure the masks over their faces. The woman's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, but she couldn't tear her gaze from Daniel. He wasn't even fazed. In fact, he looked almost pleased. "You see," he continued calmly, adjusting his own mask with a single, fluid motion, "the real beauty of this operation is its simplicity. We don't need to ask for anything. You've already left a trail. All I have to do is follow it." She stared at him, eyes wild with desperation. You can't just make people disappear," she shouted, her voice muffled behind the mask. Daniel chuckled, the sound low and chilling. "I think you'll find that I can," he replied. "And so can the people I work for." The plane began its descent, the nose dipping sharply. The captain's voice came back over the intercom, colder and more detached than before. "Prepare for arrival," he intoned. "We hope you enjoyed your flight." The woman's eyes snapped to the window, her heart hammering wildly. But it wasn't an airport she saw below them. It was an airstrip, isolated, surrounded by dense forest, with black SUVs lining the runway like silent sentinels. She turned back to Daniel, her face pale with fear. "What is this? Where are you taking me?" Daniel leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Home," he said simply. "For a little debriefing." The wheels touched down with a jolt, and the cabin erupted into chaos, passengers muttering, whispering, casting anxious glances out the windows. Daniel unbuckled his seatbelt, smoothing his suit with practiced ease. He stood, extending a hand to her. "Come along," he said. "We wouldn't want to keep them waiting." She stared at his hand, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers slipping into his grasp. His hand was cold, firm, unyielding. He pulled her to her feet, his grip ironclad. As they moved toward the exit, the other passengers watched in silence, their faces pale and expressionless. She glanced back, her eyes desperate for any sign of help. But there was none. Only the silent faces of strangers, unwilling, or unable, to intervene. Daniel leaned in close as they reached the open hatch, his voice just a whisper against her ear. "Remember," he murmured, "this was your move. I'm just playing the game." They stepped onto the tarmac, the black SUVs waiting with engines idling. Men in suits stood in perfect formation, faces expressionless, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Daniel guided her toward the nearest car, opening the door with a flourish. "After you," he said, his tone almost pleasant. She hesitated, looking back at the plane, at the passengers staring back at her through narrow windows. But it was too late. It had always been too late. With a resigned breath, she climbed inside, the door shutting with a soft, inevitable click. As the SUV pulled away, Daniel watched it disappear down the isolated stretch of road. His phone buzzed once more. He glanced down at the screen, his expression unchanging. "Pawn captured. Game continues." He smiled, slipping the phone back into his pocket. The game was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun.